The monastery archive was colder than the winter air outside, the kind of chill that settled into the bones and made time feel slower. Dust hung in narrow beams of sunlight spilling from high, grimy windows, illuminating the labyrinth of shelves stacked with brittle parchments and leather-bound volumes. Miles Hawthorne, the quiet archivist, had worked here for 7 years without ever finding anything worth more than a historian's footnote. His job was to preserve, catalogue, and, most importantly, never disturb what had been sealed by centuries. That was why the chest drew him in like a whisper. It was tucked deep behind a leaning bookcase, covered in cobwebs so thick they resembled lace. The lock was rusted, the iron hinges swollen from damp. It wasn't listed in any catalogue, not even in the oldest ledger from the 18th century. Miles brushed the dust from its surface, revealing a faint crest stamped into the wood. A crest he recognized instantly from a course he'd taken years ago. Royal, without a doubt. He hesitated, his gloved fingers resting on the lock. Breaking it would be against every professional oath he'd ever sworn. But the thought of what could be inside, what had been hidden for hundreds of years, pulled at him harder than caution. With a quick glance over his shoulder, he took a thin chisel from his workbench and pressed it into the lock. The brittle metal gave way with a soft snap. Inside, wrapped in layers of decayed linen, was a single manuscript. Its leather cover was darker than any he'd ever seen, the hide smooth yet scarred with age. On the spine, in faded gold, was a title in Latin, De Origine Pestis, on the origin of the plague. Miles felt his stomach tighten. He had spent his academic youth studying the Black Death, one of humanity's greatest catastrophes, but no manuscript by that title had ever been recorded. He placed it on the table with care, as though it might vanish if moved too quickly. When he cracked it open, the first breath that escaped carried the scent of centuries, dry parchment, old ink, and something faintly metallic. The opening page was decorated with intricate illustrations, ships rocking on stormy seas, rats crawling across ropes, skeletal figures crowned like kings. Beneath the images, lines of text in precise Latin told of a great pestilence carried on the breath of the east wind. Miles leaned closer, tracing the faded ink with his eyes. The handwriting was neat, methodical, and oddly modern for the time period. It felt less like the fevered work of a monk and more like the precise record of someone who knew exactly what they were describing. The margins were filled with symbols and diagrams, rats dissected in cross-section, grain sacks with worm-eaten holes, and small annotations noting ports and dates. His pulse quickened. The dates matched the earliest known outbreaks of the plague, but they began years before the accepted historical record. In the bottom corner of the second page was something stranger still, a faint watermark in the shape of a crown. Miles knew it well. It belonged to a short-lived royal dynasty that had been wiped from the official lineage after a coup in the 14th century. What connection could there possibly be between a forgotten royal house and the deadliest epidemic in human history? He turned another page and felt a jolt. There, pressed between the leaves, was a thin scrap of parchment sealed with a tiny blob of crimson wax. Stamped into the wax was the same crown. The seal was unbroken. For a moment, Miles simply stared, feeling the weight of the room pressing in. Whatever was inside had been locked away not only by a chest, but by the will of someone powerful enough to keep it hidden for centuries. His hands trembled as he placed the manuscript back in the chest. He should report this to the head archivist, or perhaps the university. But deep down, he knew what would happen. The chest would vanish into a vault, and whatever truth it contained would stay buried. No, this discovery was his now, and if the manuscript really told the true origin of the Black Death, the world might not be ready for what it revealed. If you're enjoying this story of justice and hidden strength, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple act of prejudice turned into the most valuable lesson of Miles Hawthorne's life. With that silent vow, Miles locked the door to the archive, drew the curtains, and lit a single lamp. The manuscript waited on the table like a patient predator. And with the turn of the next page, the first whisper of its deadly secret began to crawl out of the dark. The ink was brown with age, yet the words carried a clarity that unsettled Miles. The Latin was flawless, the script unshaken by haste or fear, as though the writer had intended their work to survive centuries. He turned another page, and the first illustration made his skin crawl. A rat, its fur rendered in delicate strokes, sat perched on the edge of a barrel. Beneath it, swarming shapes, fleas enlarged beyond natural proportion, were etched with chilling precision. In the margins, someone had sketched the profile of a merchant ship, its hull marked with tiny black dots. The ships bore flags he didn't recognize, striped banners with an emblem resembling the crown from the manuscript's seal. Miles whispered the text aloud in translation, his voice barely audible over the soft rustle of parchment. The vermin travel in the grain and in the dark corners of the hull. They carry the sickness from port to port, as commanded. He froze. As commanded. It wasn't a phrase one used for nature's random cruelty. It implied intent, control. The next section read like a merchant's logbook. Each entry listed a date, a port, and a number. Miles realized with growing horror that the numbers didn't mark goods or cargo, they marked deaths. He leaned back, the chair creaking under him. He had always understood the Black Death as a tragic accident of history, an unstoppable wave of disease that swept across continents. But here, in his hands, was a record that spoke of deliberate transport. In the lower margin of one page, a smaller, fainter script appeared, almost as if the writer hadn't wanted it to be seen. Miles squinted and deciphered it. The sickness will cleanse the land, the weak shall perish, the strong will inherit. He pressed a hand to his forehead. The language wasn't scientific, it was political. This wasn't just the account of an epidemic, it was a manifesto. Turning the page, he found a series of diagrams, maps drawn with obsessive detail. They traced the Mediterranean coastline, dotting certain harbours with red ink. Genoa, Messina, Marseille, Alexandria. But alongside them were smaller, almost forgotten ports, names he recognized only from obscure footnotes in medieval trade records. The pattern was deliberate, the spread like a carefully measured spill. Miles reached for his notebook, intending to copy the maps, but paused. His mind flashed with the image of the head archivist's stern face, the university's board of trustees, the inevitable gag orders that would follow. He couldn't shake the sensation that every tick of the clock brought him closer to losing the manuscript forever. A sudden creak echoed through the archive. Miles's head jerked toward the sound. The hallway beyond the locked door was empty, but the old building had a way of making silence feel alive. He pushed the thought away, telling himself it was the timber settling in the cold. Still, the hair on the back of his neck prickled. When he looked back at the manuscript, his eyes fell on something he had missed before. Along the bottom edge of one page, invisible until caught by the lamplight, a faint trail of shimmering ink glinted. writing that seemed to have been hidden deliberately. He tilted the page and read, "Speak not of these words outside the brotherhood, for the wrath of the crown is swifter than the pestilence itself." Miles swallowed hard. This wasn't just a record, it was a warning, and whoever had written it had wanted to make sure its secret stayed buried in more ways than one. He closed the manuscript gently, but his mind refused to rest. Why had a royal house been tied to the earliest outbreaks of the plague? And why did these maps seem to place the origins years before any official chronicle dared to claim? He blew out the lamp and sat in the dark, his fingers still resting on the cover. Somewhere, deep in his chest, he knew. Once he finished reading, he would no longer be an archivist cataloguing the past. He would be a keeper of a truth powerful enough to rewrite it. The following morning, the frost on the monastery's courtyard's stones crunched beneath Miles's shoes as he made his way back to the archive. The manuscript had kept him awake all night, its images of diseased rats and deliberate maps crawling through his thoughts like the plague itself. When he unlocked the archive door, the air felt heavier, as if it had been holding its breath in his absence. The manuscript was exactly where he had left it on the table, but something new caught his eye. A thin trail of dust disturbed near the chest. His heart skipped. Someone had been here. He checked the locks, the windows. Nothing was forced. Still, the idea that another pair of eyes might have seen what he'd uncovered made his pulse quicken. He sat and turned the pages slowly, looking for where he had stopped. That was when he found it. Wedged between two folios, almost invisible, a narrow ribbon of vellum stamped with a wax seal. This seal was different from the others. Instead of the crown, it bore a cross entwined with a serpent. Miles's mind raced through heraldic references. It wasn't a royal emblem, it was ecclesiastical. With the careful precision of a man diffusing an ancient trap, he broke the seal. Inside was a folded scrap of parchment, no larger than his palm. The handwriting was rushed, uneven. "To my brothers, should the crown betray its oath, the sickness will be our tool. Keep the ports open, the wind will do the rest." Miles sat back, stunned. This was no accidental contagion. It was a coordinated effort, and worse, it hinted at collusion between secular and religious authorities. The phrase "betray its oath" gnawed at him. What oath? What betrayal could justify unleashing a pestilence? His eyes dropped back to the manuscript. In the margins around this inserted note were tiny, almost imperceptible drawings. Rats scurrying along rope lines, ships stacked high with barrels of grain, and, most chilling, a crude crown drawn in the corner of a map that marked a single harbour in crimson ink. It was a port Miles had never heard of. Caldra. He dug through reference books until he found it. An obscure medieval harbour on the coast of what is now southern France. It had vanished from most maps after the 15th century, likely due to silting or destruction. Yet in the manuscript, Caldra was marked not once but 5 times, with dates spanning 2 decades, always preceding major plague outbreaks in Europe. The idea was monstrous. Caldra wasn't a victim of the plague. It was its source, a staging ground. As Miles traced the red ink routes outward from Caldra, his mind flashed to the earlier warning in the shimmering ink. "Speak not of these words outside the brotherhood." Whoever this brotherhood was, they had been gatekeepers of this truth, ensuring it never escaped into the open. A sudden knock jolted him, sharp, deliberate, echoing through the empty corridor. "Miles Hawthorne?" The voice was male, authoritative. He slid the manuscript into the chest and pulled an old ledger over it just as the door creaked open. A man in a dark wool coat stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. He carried himself like someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I'm Dr. Alistair Kellan," the man said, extending a gloved hand. "I'm with the University Historical Council. I understand you've uncovered something unusual." Miles forced a polite smile, his mind scrambling. No one outside the monastery should have known. "I'm not sure what you mean." Kellan's gaze lingered on the chest for a fraction too long. Then, without another word, he produced a small card from his coat and set it on the table. "If you find something relevant," Kellan said, his voice low, "contact me before anyone else. For your own sake." The door closed behind him, but the scent of cold air and the weight of his warning lingered. Miles stared at the card, then at the chest, and felt the cold certainty settle over him. Others already knew this secret existed, and they would stop at nothing to control it. That evening, the monastery's refectory was nearly empty. A few monks sat hunched over their bowls, their quiet murmurs blending with the faint crackle of the hearth. Miles had barely touched his food. His thoughts spun in a tight circle around the manuscript, the name Caldra, and the unwelcome visit from Dr. Alistair Kellan. When the scraping of the benches signalled the end of supper, Miles slipped away, not to his quarters, but to the small reading room reserved for visiting scholars. It was there that he had arranged to meet Professor Eleanor Greaves, a medieval historian he trusted more than anyone else in his field. If anyone could help him interpret the political implications hidden in that manuscript, it was her. She arrived wrapped in a thick scarf, her eyes sharp beneath a fringe of wind-tossed hair. "You sounded urgent," she said, setting down her satchel. Miles wasted no time. He laid the manuscript on the table, open to the page with the crimson-marked port. Eleanor leaned over it, her brow furrowing. "This handwriting," she began, then stopped, her gaze darting to the margins. "You realize this symbol, the crown, was banned from royal records after 1362. Officially, it never existed." Miles nodded. "And this port, Caldra, you know it?" She hesitated. "Only in passing. It was a minor harbour." "Gone by the late 15th century. But in certain less public circles, Caldra is mentioned as a black port." "A what?" "A harbour where goods and people moved without taxation, without oversight, controlled by both merchants and, let's just say, politically motivated patrons." She traced the red roots branching out from Caldra. "If the plague was moving through here, it wasn't chance. Someone ensured it." Miles leaned forward. "The text says, 'as commanded.' Eleanor, this wasn't just negligence. It was a weapon." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "You're implying state-sanctioned biological warfare in the 14th century?" A log in the hearth split with a sharp pop, making them both jump. Eleanor glanced toward the door before lowering her voice further. "If this is true, Miles, you have to be careful. People have been silenced for less." He studied her face, the lines of worry etched into it. "You've heard of this before?" "I've heard whispers," she admitted. "A theory among fringe scholars that the initial outbreak of the Black Death was accelerated, that certain factions used it to destabilize rivals. But there's never been proof. If what you found is authentic—" She trailed off, shaking her head. Miles slid the vellum ribbon with the serpent cross emblem toward her. "There's also this. Ecclesiastical involvement." Her eyes widened slightly. "The Order of St. Veritas," she murmured. "An obscure monastic group. Officially, they were archivists and scribes for the crown. Unofficially—" She let the thought hang. Miles understood. If church and crown had worked together to unleash the plague, the moral rot ran deeper than he'd imagined. Before Eleanor could say more, a sharp knock echoed from the far end of the hall. The door creaked open, and one of the younger monks stepped in, his expression stiff. "Brother Miles, you have a visitor." Miles exchanged a look with Eleanor. "Who?" The monk hesitated. "He didn't give a name. Said you'd know who he was." A chill coiled in Miles's stomach. "Tell him I'm busy," he said. But the monk's silence told him the man was already inside. Eleanor reached for her satchel. "Miles, hide it, now!" They slid the manuscript back into the chest, just as the shadow of a figure filled the doorway. Broad shoulders, dark coat, and the faint glint of eyes that didn't blink often enough. "Evening," the man said in a voice like gravel. "We need to talk about what you've been reading." The man stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, shutting the door with a slow, deliberate click. The sound seemed to seal the room. His coat was damp from the mist outside, beads of water rolling down the fabric and dripping onto the flagstone floor. Miles could feel Eleanor stiffen beside him. The newcomer's eyes roamed the reading room, lingering for a moment too long on the table where the manuscript had been moments before. "You're Miles Hawthorne," he said, though it was not a question. "And you've been looking at something that doesn't belong to you." Miles's instinct was to deny it, but something in the man's tone told him that would be pointless. "Who are you?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. "My name isn't important," the man replied. "What matters is that you hand over the manuscript, now." Eleanor's voice cut in, sharper than Miles had ever heard it. "You have no authority here. This is a monastery archive. Everything inside is under the custodianship of the Order." The man's mouth curled into a humorless smile. "Authority? I have something better. Reach. And I'm telling you, the further that book travels, the shorter your lifespans get." Miles felt his chest tighten. "Why?" The man took a step closer, his boots echoing against the stone. "Because some truths are heavier than any crown, Mr. Hawthorne. That manuscript contains one of them, and there are people, powerful people, who've been making sure it stays buried for over 600 years. Miles glanced at Eleanor, whose eyes flickered toward the closed satchel at her feet. Inside, hidden beneath a stack of harmless notes, was the vellum ribbon with the serpent cross emblem. If the man searched them, it would be over. "I don't know what you're talking about," Miles said finally, forcing his voice into something approaching calm. The man's gaze hardened. "I think you do. And if you care about your career, your safety, even this place." He let the sentence trail off, the implication hanging heavier than his words. Without another word, he turned and left, his footsteps fading into the echoing corridor. The silence he left behind felt sharper than any threat. Eleanor was the first to speak. "He knows." "Yes," Miles said, "and so do I." They spent the next hour hunched over the manuscript, their nerves fraying with every page. The section they focused on now was different from the rest. It was a series of crude but haunting maps. Each map marked the Mediterranean coastline, but the details were not of trade routes or defensive lines. Instead, small rat icons dotted key locations, each with a date beside it. The handwriting here was less precise, almost hurried, as if the author had been documenting events in real time. One map stopped them cold. It showed the familiar ports, Genoa, Marseille, Messina, but also a series of smaller, nearly invisible dots. Eleanor traced them with her fingertip. These are minor ports, forgotten by most historians. But look at the sequence, northward, month by month. It's too clean, too fast for natural spread. Miles felt the same chill he had experienced the first night. Which means, this was orchestrated, Eleanor said, her voice low. These rats weren't stowaways, they were cargo. In the margins, a short note in Latin confirmed it. The beasts arrive before the message, the sickness follows. Miles shut the book, his decision hardening. If this is true, Eleanor, history is a lie. Every history book, every lecture I've ever given, it's all wrong. Her eyes met his, steady and unblinking. Then the question is, do we correct it or survive it? The lamp between them guttered, throwing their shadows onto the wall. Two figures hunched over a truth too dangerous to speak aloud. Somewhere, far beyond the monastery walls, someone else was watching the same flicker of light and waiting for it to go out. By the next morning, Miles had decided to photograph the most critical pages before anyone could take the manuscript from him. He arrived at the archive before dawn, his breath visible in the unheated air. The building was silent except for the creak of old wood as he moved through the narrow aisles. He set up his small camera on the work table and opened the manuscript to the section they'd studied the night before. The maps lay before him like a confession. He began snapping photos quickly, pausing only to adjust the angle so the light caught the faint, hidden inks. Each click of the shutter felt like a clock ticking down to something inevitable. When he reached the final section, his hands froze. The tone of the writing had shifted, no longer clinical or descriptive. These pages read like a confession, heavy with guilt. The author described a great experiment, not merely to spread the pestilence, but to observe it. The ships carried sacks of grain already seeded with the plague. We marked the rats, bound them to the cargo. In each port we watched the fever rise. The Crown demanded records of the days to death, the number buried. This was no accident. It was a trial, and the trial succeeded. Miles's stomach twisted. He had known the truth was bad, suspected it even, but to read it in the perpetrator's own hand made his skin crawl. Further down the page was a name. The ink was faded, but still legible. Lord Reynard of Caldra. Miles searched his memory. Nothing. The name had been erased from history, like the port itself. Eleanor's voice echoed in his head. People have been silenced for less. He took a final photograph and closed the manuscript, tucking it into a protective wrap. But as he slid it into the chest, he noticed something else, an envelope hidden in the false bottom. Inside were 3 small parchment slips, each marked with the serpent cross seal. The first was a list of ports with dates beside them. The second was a tally of deaths, tens of thousands in neat rows. The third was a letter. Brother Veritas, should the crown falter, you will have the means to cleanse the realm. The pestilence is the purifier. Do not hesitate. Miles shoved the slips into his coat, just as the sound of footsteps echoed from the main hall. They were heavy, purposeful, and accompanied by the faint jingle of keys. The door swung open and 2 men entered, both wearing dark coats like the one Dr. Kellen had worn, their eyes cold and appraising. "Miles Hawthorne?" one asked. Miles's mind raced. "Who's asking?" "We've been sent to collect a manuscript." It doesn't belong here. His hand drifted instinctively to his coat pocket, where the slips of parchment pressed against his ribs. He forced himself to remain calm. I don't know what you're talking about. The taller man stepped closer. Then you won't mind if we search the place? Miles swallowed. They weren't here to ask. They were here to take. And if they found what he'd hidden, it wouldn't just be the manuscript disappearing. As the first man reached for the chest, Miles realized he had only seconds to decide. Stand and fight for the truth, or run before it was swallowed forever. Outside, in the courtyard beyond the narrow windows, the bells began to toll for morning prayers. But to Miles, they sounded like a warning. Miles's heart pounded so loud he feared the men could hear it. The taller one knelt by the chest, his gloved hands curling around the lid, while the other began scanning the shelves with the slow, deliberate focus of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. In that moment, instinct took over. Miles shifted his weight, moving toward the far end of the work table where his satchel lay. You'll need clearance from the monastery's prior before you can, he began, but the taller man cut him off with a flat look. We don't need clearance. It was the way he said it, final, unshakable, that told Miles this was more than an academic inquiry. These men weren't here on official record. The man at the chest flipped the latch. Empty. Miles kept his face neutral, though adrenaline surged through him. The manuscript was in Eleanor's possession now. She had taken it under her scarf the night before when they parted ways. But the 3 serpent cross slips were still in his coat, pressing like a brand against his side. The shorter man's eyes narrowed. Where is it? I told you, Miles said, his voice steady despite the tension coiling in his gut. I don't know what you're talking about. The taller one stood, stepping into Miles's personal space. We've been patient. Don't make us lose that. Miles forced a faint academic smile. Then, I suggest you take up your concerns with the University Historical Council. The man stared at him for a long, heavy second, then jerked his head toward the door. We'll be back, and when we return, if that manuscript's still missing... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. When they were gone, Miles sagged against the table, his fingers trembling slightly as they brushed over the slips in his pocket. He knew they'd return, maybe with more men, maybe with less civility. That evening, he met Eleanor in a dimly lit cafe far from the monastery. She was already there, the manuscript tucked in a leather case at her feet. They came to you, didn't they? She asked. Miles nodded. They searched the archive. They'll be back. Eleanor slid the case across to him. We can't keep it here. We need to copy it. Everything. Then hide the original somewhere they'll never think to look. He hesitated. And the slips? Her eyes widened when he pulled them from his coat. She read them in silence, her knuckles whitening around the fragile parchment. This is worse than I imagined, she whispered. This isn't just evidence of intent. It's a manual, a repeatable method. Miles leaned closer. If we release this, Eleanor, we're not just rewriting history, we're putting a weapon into the world. For a long moment, neither spoke. The cafe's faint hum of conversation seemed far away, irrelevant. Finally, Eleanor said, Then we don't release it. Not yet. We make sure it survives, but we control who sees it. Miles thought of the men in dark coats, of Dr. Kellen, of the centuries-long chain of hands that had guarded this secret with silence. If they hid it again, they'd be no better than those who came before. But if they exposed it recklessly, they could unleash something far worse than the plague that had already scarred history. He exhaled slowly. All right. But if something happens to either of us, the other finishes it. Eleanor nodded once, solemn. They didn't see the man watching them from across the street, his breath fogging the cafe window. He was on the phone, his voice low but certain. "They've got it, both of them. Do I follow?" A pause. Then a cold reply crackled through the receiver. "No, let them run for now. The truth always finds its way home." 3 months later, the winter snows had melted into muddy streams that wound their way through the cobblestone streets of Marseille. Miles walked with his collar turned up against the wind, the weight of a simple leather satchel over his shoulder. Inside was nothing remarkable, at least not to anyone who didn't know its true contents. Eleanor had left Europe 2 weeks earlier, travelling under an assumed name to deposit the original manuscript in a private archive somewhere in South America. Miles didn't know the exact location, by design. If anyone came for him, he couldn't betray what he didn't know. They had spent the intervening months painstakingly photographing every page, translating the text, and encrypting the files onto 2 separate drives. One was buried in Eleanor's care. The other was now hidden inside a book of medieval poetry in Miles's study. Neither of them spoke openly about the serpent cross slips. Those had been sealed in a waterproof case and placed in a safety deposit box, registered under a false identity. Life should have returned to normal, but it hadn't. The weight of what they'd discovered clung to Miles like a second skin. Every time he gave a lecture or passed a group of tourists snapping photos of medieval churches, he felt the shadow of the truth pressing against his ribs. One grey afternoon, as he prepared notes for a seminar, Miles found himself staring at the photographs of Caldra's map. He traced the inked lines with his finger, imagining the men who had stood in candlelit rooms 6 centuries ago, discussing the deliberate spread of death as though it were a trade shipment. The plague had killed millions, and somewhere, in the blackest corners of power, those deaths had been measured, weighed, and deemed acceptable. It was Eleanor's voice on the phone that grounded him. "I've been thinking," she said. "We may not be able to publish this now, but we can seed the idea, carefully. Articles, lectures, enough to plant suspicion without handing over the weapon." Miles agreed. If they could at least shake the false certainty of the historical record, the world might be more prepared for the truth when it finally came to light. And so, in quiet, deliberate steps, they began. Eleanor delivered a lecture at a minor conference about economic anomalies in plague-era port records. Miles published a short paper on unexplored trade patterns in the Mediterranean before 1350. Neither mentioned the manuscript outright, but the breadcrumbs were there for anyone sharp enough to follow. Weeks passed. The men in dark coats did not return, but Miles never let himself believe they were gone. Some nights, he imagined Dr. Kellen standing in the back of a crowded lecture hall, waiting for him to slip. On a fog-heavy morning in April, Miles returned to the monastery for the first time since the night they'd hidden the manuscript. The archive smelled the same: dust, old wood, and the faint trace of candle wax. But something in the air felt lighter, as though the building itself was relieved the weight of that secret had been carried away. He paused at the empty space where the chest had once been and found himself speaking aloud, his voice almost a whisper. "It's safe now, for as long as it can be." Outside, the church bells began to toll, echoing across the courtyard. The sound carried the same warning he'd felt months earlier, but this time it was tempered with something else: resolve. The manuscript's revelations would not vanish again. They would wait, patient as stone, until the right moment came. Moral: the past is never as far away as we think, and the truths we hide shape the world as surely as the truths we tell. To guard a dangerous truth is not cowardice if the purpose is to ensure that when it emerges, it does so in a world wise enough to bear it. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories about how extraordinary people turn humiliation into triumph.